Hey, well, I'm Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master's Soapbox. We are going to be talking today about how we can tell a different story. If you have been a game master for any length of time, you have inevitably come to a point where the story that you've told has become old hat, routine. Players are not surprised by anything anymore. Today, we're going to talk about ways that you can make your game a different one simply by utilizing some tools to change up the way you tell your story. Before we do that, make sure that you go down and press all the buttons, like, follow, subscribe, so that the algorithm will know that you're part of our audience. And let's get after it, shall we?
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
So, how do we keep a new story going when we have been telling stories the same way for weeks upon weeks, months upon months? It comes down to really thinking about what it is that is interesting or refreshing or interesting about the story you're trying to tell. When players engage with the content, that is the dramatis personae, that is the means by which we are able to change the story and make it something different. But we can't always add new players. Our players become familiar with the tropes and the means that we like to use, and therefore the story begins to lose its luster. So we're going to talk about 10 ways that we can actually adapt or change our processes to make the game session make sense and create something completely new for the players to engage with. So the first thing we need to look at is, if we're trying to create a different story, we need to have a different vocabulary. This doesn't mean you have to go through months and months of picking up new lore, but it does mean that you might want to consider very clearly what you are saying, not just the emphasis you're trying to leave, but also the very mechanisms by which you convey that information. So, for example, if you describe a physical space as a room, then perhaps change it up and suddenly discuss the space as an antechamber or a chamber or a vault. There are so many alternative words that you can use that will convey the same information with a different context, that you can actually isolate and tune your terms so they more directly fit what you're trying to convey. So, for example, if you have decided you're going to run a pirate adventure, then the rooms are actually going to be defined in terms of the spaces inside of a ship. So you will discuss the kitchen, but instead of saying kitchen, you would call it galley. If you're talking about a large open area, then it might be a hold. Perhaps you've got, instead of doors, you consider bulkheads. And the idea of changing up your vocabulary helps the players to get a visual on the location. As you may know, I'm a big proponent for theater of the mind, and one of the best ways to bring the players into the place where you are in your storytelling is to utilize words that describe things in terms that require them to think in those terms as well. So when you speak of a space that is forward of their current position, this gives them a relatively identifiable direction in reference to the overall size and dimension of the ship, to know that to go forward it would be to go towards the front of the craft, which means they therefore have to do orientation determination, figure out where they are, and whether that means it's behind them or if it's ahead of them based on their current positioning, and therefore they have to orient themselves. And by doing it in such a fashion that they utilize the terminology that fits the environment, you are cementing that environment for the players to know proper ways to interact with it. So if they decide they are going to go pursue the sound, then they are going to determine their orientation and move towards the foredecks, and whether that means to climb to a higher deck or to descend lower into the depths of the vessel. You're actually giving them a tighter framework upon which to build their perception of the story and maintain the continuity you're trying to present. Additionally, beyond obvious things like changing up the vocabulary to identify where you are, especially if it's a transition that takes some time, perhaps you'll give leading context clues, like, for example, if there is a bundle of wet rope near one of the doorways that they've had to pass through, and as they came through that space, this wet rope does have a specific type of a knot tied in it. Perhaps they have an ability to utilize their skills to determine what that knot might represent and what kind of a reason there might be for that kind of a knot. And therefore, they are able to build up some context for what's going on in the scenes and can therefore react appropriately and in line with the story that you're trying to tell, so that they can make it their own and get what's going on within the framework by understanding perhaps a little bit better the context with every interaction that they have. Even simple things like determining how you're going to tell them the information can be helpful for filling out your perception. So, for example, change the tone with which you speak. Perhaps change up, in addition to the vocabulary, perhaps your ability to convey information can change simply by changing up how you provide them the information. For example, making questions instead of statements might work. Perhaps deciding to use a different context of your very question. So, in other words, instead of describing the length, width, height of a dimensions of a space, describe it again in terms of the word usage. So you say you've reached one of the gantries within the substructure of the hold. And with that terminology, you start to give descriptions that are relevant to that structure. So, for example, there are several ropes hanging from the gantry, descending into the depths of the hold, and several of them seem to be associated with living creatures that seem to be attached to the ropes in some fashion. By leaving information out or changing up the nuance of the information you provide, you give the players a chance to really dig into what might be in that scene that they haven't considered. For example, what in God's name would it be ropes hanging into a hold for? What would be attached to the bottom, and why in particular can't we see the bottom? Is it possible that there's a light source that we need, or perhaps there is an opening into the hold from above that we might be able to access? By giving the players narratives that beg questions, you give the players the opportunity to really make the story make sense to them, and therefore feed them what they are looking for in the story. Not necessarily what you expected them to look for, but definitely something that would be useful to them in that scene. Also, if you're going to be operating within a narrower framework, if you're going to put the scene into a certain theme, ensure that the creatures you intend to utilize match the context. So if we are in a hold of a ship and there are things that are tied to gantries from above, these objects must be fairly sizable and also must have a reason to be tied. So figure out what creatures you might include inside of a ship's hold and why they would be in that context, and therefore make it make sense so that the players can interact. So, for example, if it is a sea creature that is being held, perhaps the reason why you can't see into the bottom is that the hold is at least partway filled with water. And if so, why are they still on the ropes? Are they actually on hooks? What is holding them in place, and why? And by putting a creature in the scene that makes the best sense for your players, you give them the opportunity to begin to comprehend or understand what actually is going on and why this portion of the story even matters to their course. If your games have a very heavy combat angle, switch it up. Have a situation where there is a political discussion. Perhaps you find crewmen aboard this vessel. Apparently, it's becoming an unknown vessel that the players are exploring. Perhaps they have happened upon it on a lonely dock someplace and aren't even sure who the commanders are. Now switch it up so that the play routine is not the same old, same old. If it's always been meet the monster, kick the monster's ass, take its stuff, now you can play a situation where for example, the monster may not be attainable. Perhaps there's some reason why some crazy, insane crew has actually captured one of the elder gods of a cosmic horror level event and are keeping it at bay inside of this hold. Maybe now it's a matter of psychic interaction and the players have to utilize what their mental attributes are and consider what new skills and new abilities they might unlock by engaging with this horrible being. And by switching up the play styles, you now have changed and expanded the reasons why people want to be a part of your story, and you've expanded the richness of the environment in ways that they hadn't even expected. Ultimately, it comes down to if the game feels the same as it did the week before, this is a way to allow for the session to feel differently. If you've gone from basically hack and slash to suddenly dealing with a cosmic horror concept, your players are going to feel differently about the engagement and the encounters. They might not like it, they might like it a lot, and the only way to find this out is to allow them to explore these new places, these new concepts, by changing up the story. And that doesn't mean you necessarily change the theme or the concept of the story. In fact, you could be running fundamentally the same routines, but now you're putting it through its paces so that the players are interacting and engaging with new tools and new resources and having to think their way through the adventure in new and different ways. Now, this one's kind of an interesting element, and that is, for the most part, if your games have always ended with kill the monster, take their loot, run back to town, and sell stuff, maybe this time when they find their way free, they're on a distant shore. They're in unexplored waters. The vessel they were aboard wasn't traveling through aquatic environments, but instead was traveling through dimensional. So suddenly you're in a new place that's going to require a new set of perspectives. Even if your routine ran exactly the way you've always run it, if you innovate your ending, you're now switching up the environment and putting the players fundamentally on notice that they are now having to interact in a new way. And by innovating the ending, you provide a methodology for your players to really embrace who they are beyond the frameworks of what they've always done in the past, and therefore they have to discover new avenues of adventure. Now, this is a kind of a critical point. We've talked a lot about how you as a game master might change the story to achieve what goals you have for the story. But really, I mentioned all of this so that you as a player can take into account the decisions and actions of your players and therefore change up the world and the encounters by allowing the players to pursue whatever course they hope to advance within the framework that you've already created. By giving them the means to explore, you're giving them a broader perspective on the world in which they live and can give them, therefore, the means to make the world different and make it make sense for themselves. Now, the really challenging part for a game master is once you've started to establish these new and different locations, you have to kind of weave together the rougher edges of the story so that the players can find their way back if they desire. There's the obvious concept of breadcrumbs, but breadcrumbs, of course, can be corrupted. If you're talking about the concept of an absolute that can be altered, then that alteration has to be reversible, if not directly, at least indirectly, so that the players can fundamentally resolve the conflict that they are in and find themselves back in the world of that is familiar to them. So it's really important to not just leave the loose ends laying about, but figure out how to weave them back into the story. Generally, this comes from the player advancement, finding new skills, and then the skills can be utilized to reconnect that which is to that which was, so that the players can eventually find their way back to the world as they had experienced it before, specifically for those situations where the players may not find where you've taken the world to be something that they can address or wish to. And by having this ability to find a new connection and reweave the story back together, you're providing the players again with the agency to make the adventure what they are looking for. Ultimately, the greatest game sessions occur when there is great gameplay from everybody at the table. So it is not a matter of being the greatest game master in the world, although it feels really good to have people say such things. But the real element of genius is when the collaboration of the players make them feel like they changed the story and caused the great alterations that have come to pass. And what that really means is that your play has to be a collaborative, communicative game between players who all appreciate where we're going with the story and are driving our own personal portions of the story toward its inevitable conclusion. I want to thank you for having been here. This is Jonathan Albin in Nikos RPG and Game Master's Soapbox. I do want to remind you that you can actually purchase the full panoply of Nikos system books at the website listed below, and also follow us for more information. Subscribe so you get all the videos that we're doing, and we do record generally twice a day, so we have something new to say all the time. So hope to see you in the next one, and as my grandfather would say, this has been enough for now, so you better go play.